The air at Rhineland Air Base was heavy, not with the threat of a foreign enemy, but with the oppressive, institutional weight of its commander. Colonel Marcus Thorne was a man who cast a long shadow, a decorated warrior from the old school who believed that fear was the most effective tool of leadership. He ruled the sprawling, strategic base like a personal fiefdom, his temper a constant, low-grade storm front that threatened to break at any moment. His days were a series of public power displays, of dressing down junior officers for microscopic infractions, of holding entire squadrons on the parade ground for hours because of a single, unpolished boot. He was a tyrant in miniature, a man whose distinguished combat record had curdled into a corrosive need for absolute control. And in this kingdom of fear, Specialist Anya Sharma was less than a ghost. She was a void. Assigned to the base communications wing, she was a quiet, diligent technician, a face in the crowd who did her job with a competence that was as unremarkable as it was flawless. She kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and moved through the tense atmosphere of the base like a phantom, her goal not to be noticed, her presence a study in deliberate anonymity. Command Sergeant Major Evans, the highest-ranking enlisted man on the base and Thorne's senior advisor, saw both the colonel's tyranny and the specialist's quiet dignity. He was a good man trapped in a bad system, his conscience a constant, nagging counterpoint to his duty to a commander he neither liked nor respected. Colonel Thorne, a predator by nature, was drawn to the calm, placid surface of Specialist Sharma's demeanor. In a base filled with soldiers who flinched when he entered a room, her quiet, unwavering composure was an anomaly. He interpreted it not as discipline, but as a form of silent, insolent defiance. He became obsessed with cracking her facade, with proving that she, like everyone else, was subject to his power to inspire fear. His campaign began subtly. He would appear during her shifts, looming over her shoulder as she worked on the complex circuitry of a satellite uplink, asking pointed, condescending questions designed to trip her up. She would answer him with quiet, technical precision, never rising to the bait. He escalated, assigning her entire section to the most demeaning and pointless tasks he could devise: repainting rocks, inventorying obsolete equipment, cleaning the cavernous hangars with toothbrushes. Through it all, Anya complied without a word of complaint, her expression unchanging, her work ethic as impeccable as ever. Her refusal to show any emotional response only served to fuel his frustration. He was a bully who had found a victim who would not give him the satisfaction of her pain, and it drove him to a state of simmering, irrational fury. He was a man with a hammer who had finally encountered something that would not break, and he was determined to swing harder. The breaking point came in the most public of venues, the main dining facility during the chaotic peak of the lunch rush. The cavernous hall was filled with hundreds of personnel, a cross-section of the entire base, from fresh-faced airmen to seasoned senior officers. Colonel Thorne strode into the room, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the space, the volume of conversation dropping to a nervous murmur. He was hunting, and his eyes scanned the crowd until they found his target. Anya was standing in line, waiting for her food, a small island of calm in the bustling room. Thorne marched directly to her, his polished boots echoing on the linoleum floor. He manufactured a confrontation out of thin air, accusing her in a booming voice of having a disrespectful attitude, of failing to show the proper deference to a superior officer. The accusation was baseless, a flimsy pretext for the eruption he had been seeking for weeks. Anya stood her ground, her back straight, her hands at her sides. She did not argue, but she did not cower. She simply looked at him, her gaze level and steady. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying a note of finality that was unmistakable. It was this quiet, unbreakable dignity that finally pushed him over the edge. His carefully maintained mask of command slipped, revealing the raw, ugly face of a bully. In a fit of pure, uncontrolled rage, he drew back his hand and struck her. The sound of the open-handed slap was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed through the cavernous room, a sound that was immediately followed by a profound, absolute, and horrified silence. The entire dining facility, a room filled with over 500 trained soldiers, was frozen in a moment of collective, stunned disbelief. An officer striking an enlisted soldier was a cardinal sin in the military, a violation of the sacred trust that held the entire structure together. For a full-bird colonel, a base commander, to do so, in public, was an act of such egregious, self-destructive arrogance that no one knew how to react. Thorne stood over Anya, his hands still tingling, his chest heaving, the red flush of rage on his face. He expected her to crumble, to finally break down in tears, to give him the submission he craved. He had won. He had finally made her react. But he was wrong. Anya did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not even touch the bright red mark that was now blooming on her cheek. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on his, and the look in them was not one of fear, or of pain, or of anger. It was a look of something far colder, far more terrifying. It was a look of pity. She was looking at him as a doctor might look at a patient who had just received a terminal diagnosis. In that moment, everyone in the room, from the lowest-ranking airman to Command Sergeant Major Evans, who was already moving forward to intervene, understood that Colonel Thorne had not just crossed a line. He had just committed career suicide in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. He had struck a quiet, unassuming specialist, and in doing so, had just ended his own life as he knew it. Before Sergeant Major Evans could take the 3 steps that separated him from his disgraced commander, a new sound intruded, a sound that was utterly alien to the midday routine of the base. It was the high-pitched, piercing scream of the base-wide lockdown siren. Not the undulating wail of an air raid warning, but the steady, insistent shriek that signified an active shooter, a terrorist threat, or a catastrophic internal security breach. It was the alarm for a crisis already inside the wire. Every screen in the dining facility, which moments before had been showing the lunchtime news, now flashed with a stark, red banner. Base lockdown in effect. This is not a drill. Shelter in place. Repeat, this is not a drill. Confusion, sharp and electric, replaced the stunned silence. A lockdown? Now, it made no sense. This was not a proportional response to a personnel incident, no matter how severe. This was the response to an existential threat. Through the massive plate glass windows of the dining hall, the source of the impossible situation became terrifyingly clear. 3 sleek, white C-21 Learjets, the kind used exclusively for transporting the highest-ranking government and military officials, were descending on the main runway. They were not following standard approach patterns. They were coming in hot and fast, an aggressive, unscheduled arrival that had clearly triggered the lockdown. They were landing as if they were storming a beach. The 3 jets touched down with shrieking tires and screaming engines, taxiing with aggressive speed not to the VIP terminal, but directly toward the main command headquarters building, scattering the ground crews who ran for their lives. The entire base was now a whirlwind of motion. Humvees filled with heavily armed security forces personnel raced across the tarmac, setting up a perimeter, their orders to treat the situation as a potential hostile infiltration. The lockdown was absolute, a steel cage slamming shut over the entire installation. In the dining hall, no one moved. They could only watch the impossible drama unfolding on the airfield. This was not just an investigation into a colonel's misconduct. This was an invasion from the very top of their own command structure. The response was not just fast, it was impossibly, supernaturally fast. The incident had happened less than 3 minutes ago. There had been no time for a phone call to be made, for a report to be filed, for orders to be given. The response had not been initiated after the slap. It had been triggered by it. It was as if the act itself had tripped a silent, invisible alarm that echoed all the way back to the Pentagon. The doors of the 3 Learjets opened in perfect synchrony. From the first emerged an Army general, his uniform adorned with 4 stars. From the second, an Air Force general, also a 4-star. And from the third, a 4-star Marine Corps general. Each was flanked by a team of grim-faced, civilian-clothed special agents from their respective investigative services, CID, OSI, and NCS. The sight of a single 4-star general on the base would have been an event of immense significance. The sight of 3, from 3 different branches, arriving unannounced in the middle of a security crisis, was an event of apocalyptic proportions. They did not pause. They did not speak to the base security commander who approached them. They marched with a furious, singular purpose, a phalanx of absolute power, their destination clear. They were heading for the dining facility. The hundreds of soldiers in the room watched as the three most powerful men in the European command strode toward them, their faces masks of cold, controlled rage. The mystery of the lockdown was about to be solved, and everyone in the room could feel a new, more profound, and more terrifying fear begin to settle over them. This was no longer about Colonel Thorne. It was about the quiet specialist he had struck. The heavy glass doors of the dining facility were thrown open with such force that they banged against the walls. The three generals stormed into the room, their entourage of special agents fanning out to secure the area. The silence in the room was now so complete, it was a physical pressure. The generals' eyes, cold and hard as diamonds, scanned the crowd, their gazes sweeping past the cowering form of Colonel Thorne as if he were a piece of furniture. Their eyes were searching, hunting for one person. They found her. The lead general, a man whose face was familiar from countless news broadcasts, General Michael Hale, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the entire United States Armed Forces, strode directly towards Specialist Anya Sharma. He did not see a specialist. He did not see a subordinate. He stopped in front of her, and the look of cold fury on his face dissolved into one of profound, fatherly concern. He gently, almost reverently, reached out and touched the red mark on her cheek. "Anya," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Are you all right?" The question, so simple, so personal, was a detonation that shattered the entire reality of the base. Anya Sharma, Anya Hale, the quiet, unassuming communications specialist, was the daughter of the most powerful man in the military, serving anonymously as a low-ranking enlisted soldier at her own, stubborn insistence. She was a secret of unimaginable value, hidden in plain sight. General Hale kept his hand on his daughter's cheek for a moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. She simply gave him a small, reassuring nod. The quiet strength he saw there seemed to settle him, and the cold, terrifying fury returned to his face, now magnified 100-fold. He turned his gaze, slowly, deliberately, onto Colonel Marcus Thorne. Thorne, whose face had gone from red with rage to a pasty, sickly white of pure terror, seemed to shrink under the weight of that gaze. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, conversational tone he used was more terrifying than any parade ground roar could ever be. "Colonel Thorne," he said, the words perfectly spaced, each one a hammer blow. "Your command is over. Your career is over." He gestured dismissively with his hand. "These agents will escort you to a pre-trial confinement cell at Mannheim. You will remain there until your court-martial. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it." Thorne opened his mouth to speak, to stammer an excuse, an apology, anything. But no words came out. His world, his kingdom, his entire identity had been dismantled in the space of 30 seconds. The special agents moved in, silent and efficient, taking him by the arms. He did not resist. He was a broken man. As they led him away, a fallen tyrant being frog-marched out of his own castle, the base lockdown was not lifted. It was just beginning. The base remained under lockdown for 72 hours. It was not a security measure. It was a forensic dissection. The three generals and their teams of investigators systematically took Colonel Thorne's command apart, piece by piece. They interviewed hundreds of personnel, uncovering a pattern of abuse, corruption, and misconduct that was breathtaking in its scope. It was a swift, brutal, and necessary cleansing. A new, temporary base commander was flown in, a quiet, professional officer who immediately began the work of restoring morale and order. Command Sergeant Major Evans was one of the first people the generals interviewed. He told them the unvarnished truth of what he had witnessed, not just in the dining hall, but for the past year. He was commended for his integrity, his testimony forming a key part of the case against Thorne. 2 days later, Anya found him in his office, working late. The base was still quiet, the shock of the events still lingering in the air. She walked in and placed a fresh, hot cup of coffee on his desk, just the way he liked it. He looked up, startled, at the quiet specialist who he now knew carried more power in her little finger than a roomful of colonels. She didn't mention the incident. She didn't need to. "I just wanted to thank you, Sergeant Major," she said softly. For being a good NCO. He understood. She was thanking him for what he had been about to do, for the courage he had been about to show by standing up to Thorn. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement from one true soldier to another. He could only nod, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He was in the presence of a quiet greatness he had never expected to see. The next day, Specialist Anya Sharma was gone, transferred to another, unknown base to continue her quiet, anonymous service, leaving behind a legend and a vital lesson for all who remained. The most powerful person in the room is rarely the one who makes the most noise.